So, good morning. My name's Mark. If I've not met you before, I'm just part of the family here. If you've been here in the last few weeks, you'll have known that we're in the middle of a sermon series in the Gospel of John, and that's going to continue right through to next Easter. But today we're going to take a break as it's Giving Sunday and look at a different passage. We're going to look at a passage from the life of King David, which on sort of a surface level may seem an unusual passage to choose. There may be others that spring more readily to mind when we're covering this topic. But we're going to actually look at one of the points of failure in the life of David. Like all biblical heroes, he had his great moments. He also had his low moments, and it's one of those we're going to focus on. We're in 2 Samuel, chapter 24. It's the last chapter of the book of 2 Samuel, and actually the last 4 chapters of that book serve as a kind of epilogue, looking back on the life and career of King David, and then looking forward to what's going to happen in the future in Jerusalem, in Israel. So, for example, we have in chapter 22, I don't know if we can get the PowerPoint up on the screen. Great. So in chapter 22, what we have is this song of praise that David gives to his God, where he says, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, the horn of my salvation. He is my stronghold and my refuge and my savior. From violent people you save me. I call to the Lord, who is worthy of praise, and have been saved from my enemies." This is a man who has nothing but complete confidence in God, his shield. The following chapter, chapter 23, personal favorite for me in the Bible, we hear about David's mighty men, his band of close companions. We see the positive influence that David had over them, how they were inspired to stay the course, to stand strong, to risk their very lives for the honor of the name of the Lord, while others fell away and threw in the towel. There's a pattern here. Victory, renown follow when David puts his trust entirely in the hands of God. So it comes as something of a surprise when we read chapter 24, the conclusion of the book. If you've got it in front of you, follow along. I'm going to read it. It won't be on the screen, but after I've read it, we'll come back and we'll go through it sort of section by section. So chapter 4 says, "The Lord's anger again raged against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, 'Go count Israel and Judah.' The king told Joab, the general in command of his army, 'Go through all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and muster the army, so I may know the size of the army.' Joab replied to the king, 'May the Lord your God make the army 100 times larger, right before the eyes of my lord the king. But why does my master the king want to do this?' But the king's edict stood, despite the objections of Joab and the leaders of the army. So Joab and the leaders of the army left the king's presence in order to muster the Israelite army. They crossed the Jordan and camped at Aroer on the south side of the city at the Wadi of Gad near Jazer. Then they went on to Gilead and to the region of Tatim Hodshi, coming to Dan Jaan and on around Sidon. Then they went to the fortress of Tyre and all the cities of the Hivites and the Canaanites. Then they went on to the Negev of Judah, to Beersheba. They went through all the land, and after 9 months and 20 days came back to Jerusalem. Joab reported the number of warriors to the king. In Israel they were 800,000 sword-wielding warriors, and in Judah they were 500,000 soldiers. David felt guilty after he had numbered the army. David said to the Lord, 'I have sinned greatly by doing this. Now, O Lord, please remove the guilt of your servant, for I have acted very foolishly.' When David got up the next morning, the Lord's message had already come to the prophet Gad, David's seer. Go tell David, this is what the Lord has said. I'm offering you 3 forms of judgment. Pick one of them and I will carry it out against you. Gad went to David and told him, shall 7 years of famine come upon your land? Or shall you flee for 3 months from your enemies with them in hot pursuit? Or shall there be 3 days of plague in your land? Now decide what I should tell the one who sent me. David said to Gad, I'm very upset. I prefer that we be attacked by the Lord, for his mercy is great. I do not want to be attacked by human hands. So the Lord sent a plague through Israel from the morning until the completion of the appointed time, and 70,000 people died from Dan to Beersheba. When the angel extended his hand to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord relented from his judgment. He told the angel who was killing the people, that's enough, stop now. Now the angel of the Lord was near the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. When he saw the angel who was destroying the people, David said to the Lord, look, it is I who have sinned and done this evil thing. As for these sheep, what have they done? Attack me and my family. So Gad went to David that day and told him, go up and build an altar for the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David went up as Gad instructed him to do, according to the Lord's instructions. When Araunah looked out and saw the king and his servants approaching him, he went out and bowed to the king with his face to the ground. Araunah said, why has my lord the king come to his servant? David replied, to buy from you the threshing floor, so I can build an altar for the Lord, so that the plague may be removed from the people. Araunah told David, my lord the king may take whatever he wishes and offer it. Look, here are oxen for burnt offerings, and threshing sledges and harnesses for wood. I, the servant of my lord the king, give it all to the king. Araunah told the king, may the Lord your God show you favor. But the king said to Araunah, no, I insist on buying it from you. I will not offer to the Lord my God burnt sacrifices that cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 pieces of silver. Then David built an altar for the Lord there and offered burnt sacrifices and peace offerings. And the Lord accepted prayers for the land, and the plague was removed from Israel. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, so you're going to have to stick with me for a bit. We're going to have to do a bit of work, but there is payoff at the end. Right, straight away then, we are told that the nation had provoked God to anger, not told what they'd done exactly, but when we read this language, it's always something to do with the people abandoning their covenant with Yahweh, with their God. It's when what they decide to do is turn their back on his merciful care, his protection in love, and often to go and give their worship to other gods. And their disobedience is mirrored, it's multiplied by David's disobedience. He is prompted to carry out a census. And what is clear from the passage is that this is a seriously bad move. What is not so clear is why. God himself has commanded Israel to carry out a census in the past. So why is it such a bad thing to do now? Okay, now, a bit of background. As you might know already, the books of both Samuel and Kings are given a kind of fresh coat of paint, a fresh remake later in our Bibles and called Chronicles. Many of the same stories are told in both. You'll read something in Samuel and then you'll read it again in Chronicles. This story is also found in 1 Chronicles 21. If you compare those side by side, there's a bit of an odd discrepancy. Here it says that God provoked David to carry out the census, whereas in Chronicles it says an adversary was responsible, maybe even the adversary, aka Satan. What is going on? I think it's something like this. This is the balance we have to strike. When we turn away from God, like Israel had done, turning away from Yahweh, going after other so-called gods, he often allows the consequences of these bad decisions to play themselves out, often to our own detriment. He permits us to feel the force of our own foolishness in order to woo us back to his loving care. And so maybe this is what is happening here. Maybe God is allowing something like an opposing army to threaten Israel because of what they've done. And perhaps that's why David is suddenly prompted to number his troops, which is what a census is all about, finding out how many fighting men he had to call upon because it looked like war was on the borders. But then we have to ask, what did we just read 2 chapters earlier? What did I just read at the start of the sermon? The great song of confidence that David had. I called to the Lord and he rescued me from my enemies. This is the right posture for David to take. So what's become of him here? Doesn't call on the Lord. Takes matters into his own hands. He effectively says to God, back off, I don't need you on this one. I've got this one covered myself. And that would be bad enough, but it gets worse because all those men that David goes off and numbers, they're not his property. They're not his to count. These are God's people. He's their ultimate king. The shepherd boy David is just the under shepherd to the good shepherd. Yahweh is the one who takes care of the sheep. The nation belongs to the Lord. David thought it all belonged to him. I'm the king, he says. I get to do what I want with my life, my stuff, my rule, my business. And so he counts up what he thinks he owns. And it's true, isn't it, that we can identify what we value by what we measure. We count up what we care about. And it's so easy these days for us to attach a number to the things that we trust in, to come up with a metric for whatever matters most to us. The likes on our Instagram post, the size of our salary, the amount we can bench press. If we treasure it, we'll try to measure it. And I think the reason that we do this is because we are desperate for reassurance that we're doing well enough or that things are going to turn out okay, that the numbers add up, if you like. And so maybe we need to ask ourselves this morning, what are we counting? What are we banking on? If you're David, what you trust in is the size of your army. But instead of counting up his fighters, he should have been counting on God. What are you counting on to provide for your protection, to ensure that everything will turn out okay? So David gets a final chance to turn back from the error of his ways, courtesy of an unusual source, his nephew Joab, his military commander, his right-hand man. Not a godly man by any means. He'd killed a lot of men, but even he can see that this action was asking for trouble. He says to David, are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this? And we should listen to voices of wisdom very carefully, wherever they come from. But then the ominous line is, the king's edict stood, despite the objections of Joab and the leaders of the army. So Joab gets sent out on this fool's errand, traveling the length and the breadth of the country, tallying up the troops. And a little over 9 months later, he comes back, brings his report to the king. There's 1.3 million fighting men in Israel and Judah. And at that moment, it's like the scales fall from David's eyes and he can sense the scale of what he's done. Feels guilty, feels the crushing weight of recognition of his foolish behavior. And often we get this kind of snow blindness when we're just pursuing the thing that we want and not stopping to think what it is that God wants for us. The next day then, David gets a visit from his leading prophet, who gives him some sobering news. Even though David has admitted what he did was wrong, there are still consequences to follow, both for him and for the country. David is responsible over the nation, so his failures will have consequences for them, but let's not forget they were also responsible for their own failings in provoking God to anger. And just terrifyingly and very soberingly, very tragically, for 3 days, an angel of death sweeps across the nation and people fall sick and die by the thousand. See, in carrying out this census, what David had done was truly gut-wrenching. He had hardened his heart to the commands of God. The man who was after God's own heart, his royal role given to lead people within this framework of covenant and blessing that God had given him for the land of abundance. And instead, because of David, Israel had become, well, more like Egypt, more like the land that was the empire that they needed saving from so many centuries ago. It's like David had become a new kind of Pharaoh. And this isn't what God wanted for him or for them. This wasn't blessing in the land of abundance. This was back in the shackles of slavery to death. They'd put themselves willingly right back in need of rescue again, in need of rescue from themselves. It's like salvation is required because we build up patterns of resistance to God's good rule in our lives. And this is what had happened with David. This is what the Bible is showing us, that he had developed a pattern of disobedience that becomes so ingrained that it become almost second nature. Sometime before this, David had made another grave error. It's one that you might be familiar with. It's another story that had a tragic outcome. One day he was up on the roof of his palace. He was looking out across the city, and there he sees a woman called Bathsheba bathing and overcome with desire. He takes her for himself, and she ends up pregnant. She's a married woman. David tries to cover up the scandal. Bathsheba's husband Uriah is in David's army, so he appoints Joab to go and make sure that Uriah gets killed in battle to try to cover over this error that he has made. But 9 months later, Bathsheba gives birth to a son, and immediately after, David gets a visit from his leading prophet to confront him about his sin. Again, the scale of what he's done comes rushing upon him. This wave of guilt, and tragically on this occasion, the fatal consequences fall upon his son, who dies while still a baby. Do you see the pattern? David just grasps after whatever looks good in his eyes, no matter who it belongs to. This time, it's someone's wife. And in fact, if you pay careful attention to the language, it's exactly the same terminology that is used to describe the sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They took forbidden fruit because it seemed good in their eyes. This is their story. This is humanity's story. This is our story. This is my story. My moments of disobedience come when I turn a deaf ear to God's good instruction in favor of just taking for myself whatever appears good to me in the moment. When I don't depend on God for his provision or protection in my time of need, when I harden my heart against his ways, and I take and take. Whatever I decide is good, I've got to have it, no matter the consequences. Then, in verse 17, so I've spun on a bit ahead there. In verse 17, it says that David says to the Lord that all the consequences should fall on him. He says that these sheep, these people haven't done anything. They shouldn't be dying for what I've done wrong. They shouldn't be made to carry the burden. I'm meant to be the one looking after the sheep, but this isn't the sacrifice that the Lord requires of him. God isn't calling this shepherd to lay down his life, and instead, God brings the plague to a stop of his own accord just outside of Jerusalem, and we're told that this location is near a threshing floor owned by Araunah the Jebusite on a hill known as Mount Moriah, and that's going to become important in a moment. So God instructs David to build an altar at this threshing floor site, at this place where death was stopped in its tracks. And David approaches Araunah to carry out the Lord's instructions. And Araunah says to him, you can take whatever you want, whatever you need, whatever you like the look of, it's his. And this seems reasonable. When the king comes asking for your threshing floor, you better give it to him. But David's response is adamant. He says, no, I will not take it. I will pay you the full cost. Because I think in David's ears, what he's hearing Araunah say is something like this: my threshing floor, if you want it, you take it, because that is who you are. This is the pattern of your life. Whatever you see, whatever you desire, you just take it for yourself. The fighting men of Israel, Bathsheba, and now this. Decision point, D-Day for David. Will he go on snatching hold of things that aren't his to keep? Will he repeat the same patterns? I'd suggest to you that his insistence on paying the full price is a sign that he's finally rejecting that sinful inclination that become ingrained, rejecting the same pride and distrust in the Lord that had led the nation into the plague, that had led to fatal consequences. And I think in these very last words of David that we read in this book, we see his new heart on display. He says, I will not offer to the Lord, my God, burnt sacrifices that have cost me nothing. David buys the land, and he marks the site with an altar, and he offers a sacrifice to the Lord. Sacrifice is God's means of repairing a broken relationship between him and his people. A gracious way of allowing the people to step back into his blessings and his favor. So David offers a sacrifice on a sacred spot, but a sacrifice only means something if it costs something. David pays the full price. Previously, he'd become known for counting up what he owned, arrogant show of strength in the stuff he'd accumulated. Now, in humility, he is counting up instead what he can surrender to the Lord. And the book ends saying, is that the right one? Nope, I've missed out that verse. Never mind. The book ends saying that the Lord accepted prayers for the land, and the plague was removed from Israel. This sacrifice on a special location puts a stop to the power of death, at least for now. This sacred spot, remember where it was? This sacred spot is called Mount Moriah. Why are we told that? The last time we heard about Mount Moriah was way back in Genesis. It's the mountain that Abraham climbed, thinking that there on an altar, as Tim mentioned earlier, he was going to have to sacrifice his son Isaac, the son that God had promised to him in his old age. He believed he was going to need to give up this thing of greatest value to him. And yet when he reaches the top of the mountain, at this very holy spot, God stops death in his tracks and tells Abraham to offer up a ram for sacrifice instead. God provides a substitute for the sacrifice. And Abraham says prophetically, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided, and on this mountain, on this threshing floor, sacred spot, in this historic landmark place of sacrifice and atonement and surrender, Solomon, who is David's son, would build a temple. And the temple became a site of sacrifice right down through the centuries until God came to offer another substitute for the sacrifice on a hill just outside of Jerusalem. There, the most costly sacrifice of all was offered, the son who isn't spared, the shepherd who does lay down his life for the sheep, the king who takes upon himself the sins of the people, the redemption cost that stops the plague in its tracks and ends the terror of death for all people, for all time. The full price is paid. Nothing is withheld. It's about giving then. I think we can give because we want to invest in the kingdom of God and in the ministry and mission of God, and that's good. It really is good. And I think we can want to give because we want to reflect the character of God, and we want to develop generosity in our lives, and that's really good too. But there's a more foundational layer, and it's about where our hearts are at. How do we respond in the light of God's generosity towards us? That he gave his son for our sin, that he held nothing back in demonstrating his loving kindness towards us, that he pursued us all the way to the grave and through the other side so that we wouldn't have to endure the ultimate consequence for the patterns of disobedience that we build up in our lives. Do you know that kind of love? I can't really tell you how to respond this morning. What I can tell you is that in the world, and maybe even in the church, you don't have to look very hard to find someone who will tell you that you can have it all, that we can have everything that we ever wanted, and it will come easy. Because I don't think that is the teaching of Jesus. I think when we read the Gospels, what we read is that the road of resurrection life is the same road as the narrow path of the cross. They're inseparable. So what does surrender look like? I don't think we offer burnt sacrifices anymore. That's no longer the pattern that's required. But what about the deeper sacrifice of our lives? What about the times when we're tempted to take and hold tightly onto everything we own, as if those things are going to save us? When we count up our cars and our pensions and our extensions and our holidays, whatever seems good in our eyes, and then in church we lift our hands and say, you can have it all. What are we giving? What is the cost of our sacrifice? I say this because I don't want us to learn the lesson the hard way like David had to. I want us just to join in with the pledge that he made. I will not offer to the Lord my God burnt sacrifices that cost me nothing. As we move into a time of response, I just want to end with this psalm. It's a psalm of David, of course. Psalm 20, he says, "Now I am sure that the Lord will deliver his chosen king. He will intervene for him from his holy heavenly temple and display his mighty ability to deliver. Now some trust in chariots and others in horses, but we depend on the Lord our God. They will fall down, but we will stand firm."